on.
All right, hey gang, welcome to the Chapter 12 video. Chapter 12 discusses the nature and creation of money. And you see a little text at the bottom that I'm shooting from my garage. Kind of strange, but it's kind of noisy on my front porch sometimes when traffic goes by or people walk by, and it's too sunny on my back deck, so I'm in the garage with the view of my house behind me. Email or text me that, and I'll give you another bonus point. So anyway, let's talk about money. The book talks about three functions of money, three things that money does for us. One is that it's a medium of exchange, which simply means we can use money to buy and sell things. So it's a medium, it's kind of an intermediary in that sense. One is it's a unit of account. That means it gives us units with which to measure value. So, for example, if you were looking around my garage, if you're looking at a mountain bike and a snowblower, it's really hard to say which one is worth more or how much more one is. But if you know, hey, this thing costs $500 and this thing costs $1,000, then the $1,000 item is twice as valuable as the $500 item. So those units of money are valuable to us. And then last, money can be a store of value. That means you can accumulate it, you can save it up, hold on to it, and accumulate wealth. That's not really true if you're a farmer growing corn. You can't pile up your corn and save it for 50 years and then retire on it. So money has that value as well. Realistically, anything could serve as money. I mean, we could just agree to use matchsticks or rocks or whatever, but we have come to use this system of coins and paper money. The book talks a little bit about these two terms at the bottom, commodity versus fiat money. Commodity money is money that has some value outside of its function as money. So if we were to use gold or fish or something like that, those things have some value on their own. Fiat money is just money that has value simply because the government said, this is what we're going to use, this is money. And that's what our system is. Our coins and paper really are fiat money. Some people get concerned about that. I do not. There's a bit of discussion in the book about it, but I think basically as long as our system of government and our country is relatively stable and people accept it and take it, then having fiat money is perfectly fine. Anyway, money supply. So we talk a lot about the money supply in economics, especially in macro. The money supply is really how much readily spendable money is in the economy. So it's not all the money that's ever been printed. It's not the total of bank deposits. It's how much money is in liquid form that people could quickly and easily access and spend. That's what economists mean by the money supply. And there's several different definitions of it. They call them M1, M2, M3, M4, and so on. We'll just talk about a couple of those. M1 is the one that's most commonly discussed. That's the one we'll use in this class from here on out. M1 only includes the most liquid or spendable forms of money. So it includes checking deposits in banks, in checking accounts, cash that's out in circulation, and traveler's checks. I don't think anybody uses those anymore, but basically you can think of it as checking deposits and cash in circulation. So anything that adds to those things increases the money supply. Anything that subtracts from those things decreases it. When you go up to M2, that includes some slightly less liquid forms of money. It includes everything that's in M1 plus certain savings account and money market accounts. So those are a little harder to access sometimes. Maybe you can't quite get at them with your debit card, but they're still relatively easy to convert to a spendable form. M3 and M4, as you go on, they just include more and more things that are less and less liquid and less easy to access. Anyway, for our purposes, we will use M1. So when I talk about the money supply in the exercises that you do for this chapter, if I say the money supply, assume that means M1. And recall from the last chapter, the equation of exchange that was MV equals PY. The M in that equation is the money supply. Think of it as M1. And remember again that equation helps government economists figure out how to manage the economy. We can control the rate of growth of the money supply, and by doing that, have a great influence on the rate of inflation. So we're going to talk about some of those tools in this chapter that the government uses to do those things. Okay. So first, to really understand how the government controls the money supply, you need to understand a little bit about our banking system. We have what's called a fractional reserve banking system. And what that means is banks are required to keep a fraction of their total deposits either in their vaults or in their accounts with the Fed. The Federal Reserve, you can think of that basically as a bank for banks. So every bank in the U.S. has an account at the Federal Reserve, and they can put money in and take money out, and they can borrow from the Fed. So the Fed is just like a bank for the banks. So the Fed requires every bank to keep a certain fraction of their deposits in their account. Anything else can be loaned out by the banks. That's how the banks make money. So being able to change that fraction gives the government a lot of control over the size of the money supply. So we'll talk about that as we go. So that fraction that must be kept in the reserve is called the required reserves or the required reserve ratio, and that's an important tool, as we will see. So here's a really simple example. Assume that the Fed has set the required reserve ratio at 20% or 0.20. Bank of Glenburn has 500 million in total deposits, and it's going to have a T account. They're really much more complicated than this, but here's a simplified example of a bank's T account. They have assets and liabilities. So the 500 million in deposits are liabilities. That might seem strange, but they're liabilities because if people come in and demand their money, the bank has to give it to them. So the bank is sort of liable for that. Under assets, since the required reserve ratio is 20%, the reserves should be 100 million. So this bank would have to have 100 million in its account with the Fed, and then the excess, the other 400 million, can be loaned out. So the bank can loan out up to $400 million. Sometimes banks go over. They loan out more than they're supposed to. So if they had made, for example, 420 million in loans, they would simply have to borrow 20 million either from another bank or from the Federal Reserve itself to meet their required reserves. So that's totally possible too. So the deposit multiplier is this process by which the Fed sort of creates or destroys money. And mathematically, the multiplier is just the inverse. It's 1 over the required reserve ratio. So if the required reserve ratio is 10% or 0.10, the multiplier is going to be 10. 1 over 0.10 gives you 10. So what that means, the interpretation is, anytime the Fed injects a dollar into M1, $10 worth of new money eventually is created. So that's what the deposit multiplier means. Now, you might not quite understand that yet. So this graph sort of walks you through that process. We start at the top left. The Fed's Federal Open Market Committee decides to increase M1, and it buys bonds. That's one way that they might try to do that. So the Fed, in this example, writes a $100 million check to Salomon Brothers. Salomon then has $100 million more in cash. They're going to put that money into the bank. Once it goes into a bank, say Citibank in this example, if the reserve requirement is 15%, Citibank has to hold on to 15 million in its account with the Fed. Then it gets to loan out 85 million. In this example, it's loaned out to USX. USX spends that or takes the $100 million, deposits it into its bank. Then the bank has to hold on to 15% of that, which is roughly 13 million. Then it can loan out the other 85%, which is 72 million. So the city of Boston takes that out and does something for road construction. But basically, this is the process of how the multiplier works. Every time money is put out into the economy, it gets spent. Somebody puts it into a bank. A portion of that gets reserved. A portion of it gets loaned out. The money that gets loaned out, we assume gets spent, deposited back in the bank again, and a portion of that gets loaned out. So that repetitive process again and again and again is the multiplier, and that is how the Federal Reserve can create money. Okay, I'm going to pause it there. I'm almost out of time, and I'll make a part 2 shortly.